Pedro, how long have you been working on this? Is this relatively new or something that it is close to the finish and set it?
Oh, that paper, do you mean?
Yeah. The paper that we'll present today.
That paper is one of the chapters of my PhD thesis. Okay. So I have been working for, I don't know, let me see, 2 or 3 years, but we are still working on that. So we have to collect more data and to do more tests and robust tests. So yeah, so we're still working.
Okay. So it is in the process of transforming from a PhD thesis chapter to a publishable paper. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but in general, to publish a paper, you spend like 5 years, or so probably we will be working for more a couple of years on that paper. So yeah, it's still working.
Okay.
And I have 2 more, the other papers of my thesis that's about railways in Brazil. It's different, but the idea is to analyze the impact of the railways in Brazil and skill transformation, development. So,
okay. Yeah, should we get started? So thank you everybody for joining us today for the second meeting in our third series of webinars on Ibero-American Economic History. Today we're delighted to welcome Pedro Américo, who is postdoctoral research fellow at the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia. Before joining UBC, Pedro obtained his PhD at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, PUC-Rio, and was Fulbright visiting research fellow at UCLA. So we're delighted to have Pedro join us today from a very, very early morning in Vancouver, 7 a.m. over there. So Pedro's research interests include economic history and economic development, as we'll see today, but also health economics and political economy. He has published recently on health economics in Brazil as well. Pedro's doctoral dissertation examined the historical origins of Brazilian development with a focus on the role of railways and agrarian elites. And we're going to hear about the second of these topics today. So as usual with our webinar, we'll listen to our speaker for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. The presentation will be in English, but questions can be asked in English, in Spanish, or in Portuguese. After Pedro's presentation, we'll open the mics for everyone to be able to ask questions and participate in the discussion. All right. Thank you again, Pedro, very much. And the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Emiliano. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in that great seminar. So I will present today our project with Claudio Ferraz, Claudio professor from UBC. And for now, the name of the project is Agrarian Elites, Education and Structural Transformation, but we change the title of the paper every week. So for now, it's that one, but probably we will change in a couple of weeks. So there is a lot of evidence that show that the human capital was a fundamental driver of structural transformation during the 20th century. So there are evidence across countries and evidence within countries that places with high level of schooling in general industrialize faster than the other ones. And a lot of explanation for that. One of that is that in general that place adopts more modern technology, or the education in general helps the spreads of information and the knowledge, and that affects the process of the process of structural transformation and development. However, the investment in schooling in general is very unequal across countries and even across place regions in ASEAN countries. So the idea, the big picture here of our papers is exactly to understand the difference, how that difference in schooling emerge in a country or in area, in place, in municipalities from a country, and how that difference persists over the time. And the idea here of the paper is to bring to put together a political economy analysis to understand that process of emergence and persistence of inequality in the investment in schooling. So that's the first question, the first idea, but is also to understand how that inequality, that unequal investment in schooling can affect the modernization of the economy and the structural transformation of that economies, and how that affects long-term development. So that's the big picture here of our paper, is to analyze the emergence and the persistence of the inequality in investment in schooling, and how the political economy and the identity of the elites can help us to understand that process of emergence and persistence of inequality in investment in schooling. Okay, so but for that paper in particular, what you do is to analyze the biggest and the richest state in Brazil, São Paulo, and compare and to analyze how the political power of the agrarian elites in the early 20th century, just in the beginning of the 20th century, can explain difference in the expansion of the public schooling, and how that can impact the structural transformation across the municipalities of the state of São Paulo. But one problem to do that is how you measure the political power of the agrarian elites. And why I'm saying that? Because there are a lot of papers on the literature that analyze the political power of the agrarian elites and the long-term development, for example. But the problem of that paper is that we think that in general, they use land inequality as a proxy of political power of the agrarian elites. And the problem is with land inequality is that in general, it's very difficult to separate what is economic inequality and a political inequality. So in general, when we use land inequality as a proxy of political power of the agrarian elite, we can't separate what is the impact of the political inequality and the economic inequality. Okay, so what you create here in that paper, and I think it's new, is choose two different measures of the political power of the agrarian elites. The first one is that we will exploit new data from Brazil from various data by occupation. So in 1905. So in 1905, we can see the occupation of each of that guys that are voting in the elections. So with that data, we can create a measure of the political power of the agrarian elites. And the other variable that we create is we cannot just identify the occupation of the voters, but we also can identify the occupation of the elected politicians. And how we do that? You basically match the surname of the elected politicians in 3 points of time over the 20th century with the surname of a list of landowners that we have from the 1920 census. So basically here, what you have in the papers is two measures of political power of the agrarian elites, the share of voters of that elites, of the agrarian elites, and the identity of the local politicians elected, okay, in 3 points of time, and how that politicians, they are connected with the agrarian elites or not, okay? And the idea is to analyze how that identity of the political elites impacts first the school inputs, or I mean the share of children attending school, the number of teachers, the number of schools, and how that impacts on, for example, on an education outcome like literacy rates, and the consequence of that for the structural transformation of the municipalities over time. Or more specifically, we have occupation data from the census that we can track how the municipalities, for more or less political power for agrarian elites, developed over the 20th century in respect the share of people working in agriculture, in manufacturing, and the service sector. So that is the basic idea of the paper. So before to start to talk about historical background and data, I will just expose here just a preview of our results. Okay. So basically, our first result is like a short-run result, is that the political power of the agrarian elites in the early 20th century in Brazil reduced investment in education and lower literacy rates. So how we conclude that? We conclude that basically compare municipalities with high and low agrarian elites political power controlling for a bunch of things. So here we don't have like a super different or super innovative empirical strategy. We don't have like a super different instrument. For example, basically we use two empirical strategies. The first one is a cross-section, compare municipalities with low and high agrarian elite political power controlling for everything that we have. That's the first empirical strategy. The second one is that for some education outcomes like literacy rate, we can follow that outcome across all Brazilian census. So in that sense, we create a panel and we do like an event study analysis, compare before and after 1905, the evolution of that education outcomes. Okay, so we will find a short one effect, but we also show that the effect persists for a long time. In general, the effect persists for many decades. In general, to be more precise, the effect persists for 50 to 60 years. And the consequence of that persistence is that the places where the agrarian elites had more political power delayed the process of structural transformation. In general, that places take more time to shift the workers from agriculture to manufacturing and service sector. But another point that is important that we found is that the effects after 50 to 60 years, it starts to decrease the magnitude of the effects. So we start to see a convergence of that municipalities with high and low agrarian elites political power. And how we will see, we have a hypothesis here that the process of diversification and change of the political elites that explain that process of convergence in the educational outcome, in the literacy rate over time. So basically, is that the main results of our paper. Okay, so now let's just to go to the related work. There are a lot of papers that that's similar from ours, and the first group of papers that analyze the inequality political institutions to long-term developments. But most of the paper in general, they analyze the impacts of something that happened in the past to something that's from the present, for examples. But the idea here of our paper is to document the changes of the time. So more than analyze the impact of agrarian elites political power on long-term development, our idea here is to document how that changes over time, how the impact changes over time. That's the most important thing for us here for that paper, and not just the long-term impact. There are other group of papers that analyze the intra-elite conflict. In general, that paper analyze how, for example, agrarian elites and manufacturing elites compete, they have different incentives, and how that impacts the expansion of mass schooling, public schooling in the countries. So But the difference of our paper here is that you will not use land inequality as a proxy of political power for the agrarian elites. We have different measures for that. One is the share of farmers' voters, and the other one is the identity of the elect politicians and how that elect politicians are connected or not to the agrarian elites. So we use different measures for the political power of the agrarian elites. Okay, and finally, just to finish here, there are literature on the persistence of a human capital over time. In general, that papers shows that, for example, in general, the human capital level in the past is associated with the human capital for today. But our paper here is to bring the whole of the politics, the identity of the politicians, and how that can impact the persistence of the human capital over time. There are more papers and literature, but I think the three most important group of papers is that one here and how we are related to that papers. Okay, so now let's go to the historical background. First of all, there are I think there is three main points to say here. So Brazil have a constitution in 1891 with the beginning of the republican in Brazil, and the difference in that constitution, one respect to the elections, is that the constitution took away the voting restriction based on income, but introduced restriction based on age. Just you need to have 21 years or more to vote. To literates, you have to be literate to vote, and to gender, you have to be a male to vote. The consequence of that is that just less than 5% of our entire population voted in the beginning of the 20th century. In the particular case of the state of São Paulo, just 3.5% of the entire population that voted at that time. So just a small elites that vote in the beginning century Brazil. Okay, it's not the entire population. And the other consequence of the constitution is that the constitution decentralized the collection of the tax, of the sports taxes, and also the responsibility of the education to the state and municipalities. And the consequences of that is that you start a huge variation in how the municipalities will invest or not on education over time. Okay, so I think that's two important points. The other ones that you focus on São Paulo, the richest state in Brazil. And the interesting in the São Paulo case, because São Paulo in the beginning of 20th century was a coffee-based economy, probably the most important exporter of coffee of that time, and where the political and where the state and the state policies was basically controlled by the agrarian elites, the oligarchical power of the rural elites. And was that elites, that agrarian elites, that decided to invest or not in schooling. And the another interesting thing of São Paulo is that after the 30s specifically, the economy of the São Paulo will change a lot. Basically, São Paulo shifted from an agricultural economy to a more industrialized economy, and it will be the most important manufacturing state of the Brazil. So, and with that change, increasing urbanization, industrialization, that you will see a change again in the identity of the political elites and the economic elites. And there will be that change that will show that impacts how that the municipalities invest or not in education over the time. So I think that's the most important points on the historic background. Okay, just a graph showing how the Brazilian case is interesting. If we compare the average years of school in Brazil, for example, let's compare with US. There is a huge difference, and that huge difference in average years school persists for more than 1 century. But even when we compare the Brazilian case with the case from Argentina and Chile, the difference is huge. In the 30s, in general, the Brazilians studied less than 1 year, while, for example, the people from Argentina and Chile studied more than almost 4 years. So there is a huge difference in the investment in schooling when you compare Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. Brazil take too long to invest in education. And what you do here is try to explain that no investment in education bring the political economy to try to understand, to figure out what's happening in the Brazilian case. Okay, so most of the paper, what the paper do, the most part of the paper is that the new historical data that we collect. Okay, so basically we have three new historical data that we collect. The first one is the registers of voters by occupation in 1905, the name of the land owners in 1920 census, and the name of the politicians elect in several elections, basically in 3 points of times, okay? In between 1913 and 1922, in the 50s and the 60s, okay? So let's show that data, okay? The first data is the Mapa do Eleitorado. The Mapa do Eleitorado basically gives us the number of registered voters by occupation and municipality. So we have the name of the municipality, the number of registered voters by occupation. But how I said, just 3.5% of the population voted at that time in 1905. So what we're talking about here is like 100, 200 guys that basically control all the politics, all the policies and the politicians process of the municipalities. So what we think is that map gives us an important picture of how the political power was distributed across the elites of that municipality. So with that data, we create our main variable is that the share of the agricultural voters over the total number of voters. And we believe that share measure is a good measure of the political power of the agrarian elites of that time, okay? Here is just the density of the distribution of that variables. On the left, we have the share of voters, the franchise rate, the share of voters of the total population. As we see, just in general, most of the municipality, less than 4% of the population voted in the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, so and in the right we have the share of voters that were farmers in 1905. There is a huge variation in the share of agrarian elite political power, but we can see that in most of the municipality, more than 60% of the voters was associated with the agrarian elites. Okay, so but we exploit that variation exactly to identify how the political power of the agrarian elites impacts education and the political process. Okay. Okay. The second data is data on the name of the elected politicians. But one problem here is that we don't have a centralized data for the beginning of the 20th century of the names of that politician elects. So one solution was to collect the name of the elected politician on the local elections in the newspapers of that time. So we basically read the newspaper and collect the name of the elected politicians. So here's just an example. On the left, here is the result of the election for the municipality of Amparo in São Paulo. And we have here the name of the politician elected in the 1913 election. Okay. And what you do, you match that name of the elected politicians with a list of the landowners from the 1920 census. The idea is to match the surname to identify how the elected politicians, they are connected or not with the agrarian elites. That's the idea here. So the idea is to identify the elected politician. Here is the statistics of that connection over the time. So as I said, we have 3 points. We just have data for 3 points, okay? And we have here the share of politicians, the elected politicians, with the same surname from the landowners from that list of the 1920 census. And as you see, in between 1322, more than 60% of the elected politicians was connected to the agrarian elites. In 51 and 63 to 66, we see a drop in that magnitude to 40%, okay, over the time of that connection, okay? Okay, and finally, but our idea is not just to analyze the political, you know, the political situation or the idea is to analyze how the share of how the agrarian elite's political power impacts on the evolution of education and mass schooling of the municipalities of the state of São Paulo. So we collect data from education and income from the Brazilian census. And why you do that? Here's just an example. Here's the map from São Paulo, the municipality in 1905. In the left, you can see the share of farmers' voters, and on the right, you can see the literacy rate in 1920. You see there is completely different figures, right? In general, municipalities with more a high share of farmers' voters is associated with lower literacy rate, and is that we will analyze here how the political power of the agrarian elites, how the identity of the elected elites impact the investment in mass schooling over time, okay? So our data here is basically a cross-section covering 161 municipalities in the state of São Paulo between 1920 and 2010, okay? So the idea basically here is compare that municipality across over the 20th century, and basically, and you do that controlling for a bunch of things like geography, land inequality, railways, education, immigration, demography, like the share of people in agriculture, share of people in manufacturing, service, and so on. Okay, so let's go to the empirical strategy. And how I said, we have two empirical strategies basically. The first one is on the cross section. Compare municipalities with high and low political power of agrarian elites, controlled for a bunch of things. Okay, that's the first one, empirical strategy. The second one is use a panel data, because for literacy rates and the occupation data, the share of people on agriculture, manufacturing, services, you can follow that outcomes between 1920, between 1872 and 2010. So in that case, we can do like you can do a panel data and do like event study analysis, tracking the effect before and after 1905, and see how that affects and document how that effect changes over time. Okay, so basically having two empirical strategies here. One is a cross-sectional LES, and the other one is more event study analysis, okay? Including here the municipality fixed effects and time fixed effects. So now let's go to results, okay? I have 10 minutes or 10 minutes, okay?
Yeah.
So 10 minutes for results. So let's start with two graphs that I think that explain what we have here. The first one is that it's a correlation between the share of farmers' voters and the percentage of local politicians with the same surname from landowners in the elections between 1913 and 1922. And we see is a positive correlation in between that variables. In general, places where the agrarian elites has more power, in general, that place elects more politicians connected to the landowners. That's the first result. The second result in the short run is that places where the agrarian elite has more political power also has lower literacy rate in 1920. So what you see here is that the political power of agrarian elite is correlated with the identity of the elected politicians, and also is correlated with low investment in massive schooling. So, but of course, we can have a lot of other explanation of the results. For example, maybe the result can be explained by, for example, the franchise rate. So we control for the franchise rate, or for geography, because geography is very important to production of coffee, right? So we control for geography, and again, the results maintains. Or land inequality, of course, is very important. So we control for that. We control for transportation infrastructure. We control for baseline education. We control for baseline social economic characteristics from the Brazilian first census in 1872, like the number of immigrants, the share of people working in agriculture, manufacturing, service, the number of public employees, and so on. And also control for the number of landowners. And how we see here, the results look like a very robust results. Do not change a lot. And even here is another table, now analyze the impact of share of farmers' voters on literacy rate in 1920. Again, even controlled for everything that we have, we see that result maintains significant, or negative is significant, and also our coefficient do not change a lot. You see, it's a very stable coefficient. In general, a change in one standard deviation of the share of farmers' voters reduced the literacy rate in 6.11 percentage point, or 22%. So it's an important impact. So it's not a small one. So what I have here in the short one is that the agrarian elite political power is associated with more elect politicians connected to the landowners and a lower level of literacy rate in 1920. Okay? And why is that? And we show that that is a consequence of a lower investment in education. Here we collect input education data from the 1920 census, Brazilian census. So we have the percentage of children attending school, the number of teachers, the number of schools, and what we found here is that the agrarian elite political power is associated with low investment in education. Okay, I can show them that results, additional results we can show later. But the idea of the paper is not just analyze the impact in the short run, right? Is understanding how that the education change over time. And the best way to see that is in that graph here. In that graph, you basically split our data between municipalities with high and low agrarian elite political power, okay? And we see that in the 19th century, they have similar outcomes, education outcomes. During the 20th century, the gap between that municipalities will increase over time until the 50s. After that, we see a reduction in the gap of the literacy rate between that municipalities. So our idea here is to understand that persistence and how that persistence changed in the 50s. But the second result of the paper is to document that persistence. So I mean, the impact do not decrease fastly in the short run. The impact persists until the 50s, and just after the 50s that we see a drop in the magnitude of the effect. Another way to see that is in event study analysis, looking the impact over time, and we see that the impact persists until the 50s and then start to decrease the magnitude of the effect. In the 80s and the 70s, there is no more effect of the agrarian political power on literacy rate, okay? And the consequence of that is that they took more time for that municipalities where the agrarian elite political power had more power to modernize their economy. Here is the impact of the agrarian political power on the share of people working in agriculture, manufacturing, and the service sector. So what you see here is that agrarian elite political power is associated with more people working in agriculture and less people working in manufacturing and the service sector. And more than that, the effect persists until the 60s. So just after the 60s that we see a convergence in the municipality in respect to the share of people working in agriculture, manufacturing, service sector. So how will you see that result is that took more time for the municipalities where elite, the agrarian elite had more power to modernize the economy, to shift the occupation from agriculture to manufacturing, service sector. Okay, and the third question of the paper is why does education change after the 50s? Okay, so here we have the election in 1951 and the elections between 1963 and 1966. So what we do here is again is to match the surname of the elected politicians with the surname of the list of the land owners in 1920 census. So we see that the share of farmers voters still have an impact in 1951 election, but it's a very small impact, and just for the vice mayor. And when we analyze for the 60s elections, we do not find any more effects. So it looks like that there is a change in the identity of the elites over time, and the political power of the farmers and the landowners is no more great as it was in the past. So it looks like that in the 50s and the 60s, something changed here, and that agrarian elites lose their power. Okay. The other way to see that is that graph here. That graph is basically they show a diversification of the surnames of the political elites. On the left, you have the percentage of unique surname. You just have one surname. And on the right, you have we create like a Heffendown index of the concentration of the political elite surname. So you see a decrease in the concentration. So what that graph, I think, bring to us is basically we can see a diversification of the politicians elected over the time of the 20th century in Brazil. And our hypothesis here is that diversification explains why you start to see conversions in the investment in education across the municipalities. Okay, and the consequence of the diversification is exactly a decrease in the effects of the agrarian elite political power on investment in education. You can see that in the percentage of students attending school, number of teachers, and number of schools. Okay, and just to finalize here the presentation, the long-term effect. What you see in the long term is that the effect in literacy rate is no longer significant, but we still find an impact on a more higher education. So, for example, we found an impact on the percentage of people with completed middle school degree. You find an effect on the percentage of people with high school degree or university school degrees. But the consequence is that what we found here is that the impact basically in the long term, they shift from elementary school to more higher schools. It's basically that, the effect. And the consequences of that is that the agrarian elite political powers still have an impact on the income in the present. That effect is not a huge effect. It's a small impact. But so for example, if I start the presentation with that table, someone could say, oh, the impact is too small. Maybe it's almost, there's no persistence here. But that table did not tell how the history, because how I said here, we see that the agrarian elite political powers associate a lower investment education that effect persists until the 50s. After that, we see a converge over the time, but we still have an effect in the long term. It's not more a huge effect, it's a small effect, but we still have an effect on the long term, okay? So the conclusion, what we found here is that agrarian elite's political power is associated with a reduction in the investment in education in the early 20th century Brazil. That effect persists for many decades. And the consequence of that is that the agrarian elite political power delayed the process of modernization, of the structural transformation of the economies, okay? And after the 50s, with the change of the composition of the political elites, we see a improvement in the education level of the municipalities, and we see a convergence of the education outcomes over the time. I think that's basically the result of our paper, and I finish here, and I'm open to your questions and comments. So thank you again for the opportunity to present here the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. That was extremely interesting, and I thought very impressive work of data gathering, and very impressive, very creative use of the sources. So for questions, remember you can raise your hand using the raise hand function. You can also write questions in the chat if you'd rather do it in writing. Okay, so Jose Perez Cajias.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for this great presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I have a lot of questions. But I would like to ask something that I'm sure that has been asked before, but I was wondering if your indicator, the share of the rural voters, is this indicator showing the power of the political elites or just the structure of the municipality, the economic structure of the municipality? Because if you should expect that if your municipality is based on agrarian activity, investment in education is also lower. So I'm not really sure why this share of rural voters reflects political power and not just the structure of the economy. And the second one is related with the work of one of your colleagues, which is Felipe Valencia Caicedo, and it's also linked with a current discussion between Hausmann and Hidalgo, and they say that at the end, what matters for economic growth is not necessarily education, but knowledge accumulation, isn't it? And Felipe instead of using basic indicators of education like literacy, he looks at the numbers or density of engineers. So I was wondering, perhaps not for some of your municipalities that are extremely rural, but I was wondering if in those municipalities where the political elites are more concentrated, they didn't invest in basic education, but they invest in engineers, just for the sake of curiosity of if you have the data. Thank you very much.
Can I answer now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you so much for your questions. Yeah, one point is very important, is how you can separate what is a agrarian elite political power and what is the structure of the economy. So we do that in two ways here. In two ways. The first one, let me Here is the result. In that specification here, we control for the characteristics of the municipalities in 1872, our first Brazilian census. And we include here the share of workers in agriculture, manufacturing, and the service sector. And you show that result is robust to the control of the share of people working in that sectors. The other way to do that is using like, is doing like a bed control, use a bed control. Here we control, for example, for the share of workers in agriculture in 1905 and the share of foreigners in 1920. And what I see is that the result is still robust to the control, for example, for the share of workers in agriculture in 1905 or the share of workers in agriculture in 1872, for example. So with that controls, we think that you can separate what is the political power of the agrarian elites or what is the structure of the economy. So I think that our result is robust to that the structure of the economy. And the other point of the technology, and I think you are right in the sense that maybe the important thing is not the literacy rate, but for example the number of engineers or so on. But I think for the 19th century or for the first industrial revolution, I think you are right in the sense that the most important thing, and for example, there's the paper from Nico Voigt-Tangle, for example, they show that the important thing is not the literacy rate, but the higher education level, like the engineers, the guy that innovated, and so on. But here we analyze the Brazilian case in the 20th century. Basically, there is no innovation here in the Brazilian case, but basically you just copy the things from the other countries, for example, in our manufacturing or in our agriculture. So I think here the most important thing is how the workers can, for example, control or not a machine from the manufacturer or something like that. So for the Brazilian case in 20th century, I think the important thing is not exactly the innovation or innovation in manufacturing and agriculture, but it's more, I think, is more the level of education from the general workers. I think that's the point.
Thank you, Pedro. And David Mitch.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. It's very nice overview paper, all the data you put together, and so on. One first set of issues is you didn't make any mention of some of the prior work that has been done on Brazilian education. I'm just wondering why, if you're not aware of that, or why you didn't mention it. I'm thinking work by Aldo Musacchio. There's Tim Wegengast, Bruno Witzel, Thomas Kang. They've all worked on the history of Brazilian education, and I think their findings are somewhat different. They don't put the same emphasis you do on the agrarian elites. And I think one issue generally, there's been this longstanding issue about looking at agrarian elites and thinking they have a negative effect, but I think more recent studies have shown a variety of effects. They don't always necessarily have negative effects in various countries. So I think it's important to specify the mechanisms and the particular setting. And some of the issues I think these previous studies find, one is that I think this is both in Musacchio and Wegengast, that basically export earnings, like coffee export earnings, can play a big role in financing schooling. So that has to be allowed for. It's not just all sort of land taxes, which is traditionally why agrarian elites don't like to do it. And I think you're a bit fuzzy about agrarian elites. Sometimes you mention landowners, sometimes you mention farmers. And I think that those maybe should be distinguished. And also, since you're going into the 20th century, there's a whole issue of how was schooling at the elementary level organized? What sort of management was there? So it's not just being elected to local office. Were there school boards or school managers, and how were they set in place, and what sort of things were influencing that? Because in other countries, you would often have locally elected school boards. and that can play a role. So I think that issue could be brought into play. And then another factor, I know Bruno Witzel mentions this, and I think some of the other studies, is one factor that maybe mitigated some landowning resistance to supporting education was the fact that there was a lot of immigration coming in, and some immigrant groups were very supportive of education. So in some cases, there was pressure to provide education to attract immigrant groups and so on. So I think that's an important factor that can play a role. So those are some things that just sort of come to mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for your question. You are absolutely right when you say that I do not sit here on the presentation, the prior work is on education. There are a lot of works on education for Brazil. For example, the works from Musashi, the works from Renato Colistetti, from USP, they have very important work. I do not sit here, but I do not sit here because of the time. But in our paper, we cite that papers. We cite Musashi, we cite Colistetti, and the works of that guys on education, investment in education. So you are absolutely right. I think I need one more point here to associate our worker to the worker of the guys that study education in the 20th century Brazil. But I think in Musashi, for example, the tax collection, the tax from the exportation is very important to change how the state of São Paulo invests in education, okay? However, there is a variation across the municipalities. And what are you, for example, in Musashi, basically he's comparing the states in Brazil and the investment in education across that states. And what he shows that, for example, the tax collection is important to invest in education. And we'll see a huge investment in education in São Paulo after the beginning of the Republic. But our point here is another one, is compare the municipalities in the state of São Paulo. So we are comparing the municipalities within the state of São Paulo and how the variation in the agrarian elite political power can explain variations in the investment in mass schooling. So it's I think it's true that the increase in the collection of exports data increase the investment education for the entire state of São Paulo. I think, yeah, it's true. However, there is a variation within the municipalities in the state. And the idea here is to us is understanding how can we explain that variation and how the political economy can help us to understand that process. So I think that's one difference. Okay, let me see the another point is the how you okay, sometimes I say farmers, other times I say landowners. Yeah, the problem here is that our data is the name of agricultores voters. So agricultores can be how the landowners, or theoretically can be the guy collecting the coffee from the tree in the land. However, as I said, just 3.5% of the population was voting that time. So we are talking here about 100, 200 guys in a municipality that control all the politicians of that municipality. So we believe that the agricultores here means the agrarian elites of the municipalities and not that guy collecting the coffee from the trees in the land. And we believe that because one is the franchise rate is just 3.5%, so it's just a small part of the population that voting. And we believe that because because of our second results, that is the result that associates the share of that voters that were farms 1905 with the connection in the surname of the landowners and the elected politicians. So that's two characteristics bring us to conclude that the the share of farmers' votes in 1905 is a good proxy, variable proxy to the political power of the agrarian elites. Okay, and just the third point is the immigration. I think you're absolutely right. Immigration is very important because we already have some papers, for example, from Rudi Rocha and Claudio Ferraz for Brazil, showing that immigration increased the demand, and also the papers from Colistati show that the immigration increased the demand for education. And what you do here, this should find the robust results. Sorry, just one here. So what we do, first and for all, in our specification, we control for immigration in the 19th century, in 1872, and the results are robust to that control. And here in that table, we also control for the share of foreigners in 1920. And also, in that one is a bad control because our variable is 1905, but it's okay, just to see what's happening here. And we are still finding an effect that is negative and robust. So our effect is robust to immigration. So in that one is important to separate exactly what you said. What is the immigration effect and what is the political power effect? So I think with that control, you can separate that effect to show that the result is robust to that one. I don't know if I answer all the questions, but
yeah, no, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. We have a couple more questions left, but feel free to give very short answers or just take them home as comments if you So I have a question that is kind of a conceptual question, I guess, about what elites are, because I guess in a lot of our research we assume elites, economic elites, to be somewhat discrete groups, as if rural elites are entirely something, are different, are in a different group than military elites or that industrial elites or so on. But of course, these elites are increasingly interconnected in the early 20th century. And I noticed that in one of the sources you showed us for the newspapers, we saw some of the people that got elected. They were like coronel, right? They were like colonels. And that brought me back to some vague memory of Brazilian political history. But the idea of coronelismo enxada e voto, that idea that the weak is kind of a classic kind of work that I'm not sure what economic historians think of it now, but the idea that a weak national state relies on these local sort of economic chiefs, essentially. But because they are also part of the army, so they have some power from the national state. Right? So I was just wondering whether you had any way of controlling for whether the rural elites were also military elites, whether they were also involved in the national state in that way. And what you think about this whole issue of relationships between elites, more generally.
Okay. You're absolutely right, but in general, the coronel here is more. In general, the coronel in the municipality. Okay, in 19th century, that coronel, they have a relationship with the police, with the militaries and the local police. Okay, but in the beginning of the Republic, that changed a lot. And the coronel here is more an important guy and not a guy that has kind of military power. It's a guy that probably the guy that probably is the most important guy in the municipality, but no more with a military power, because the power is more concentrated at the federal level now and not decentralized as it used to be in the before the Republic. Okay, so but you are right in the sense that maybe it's important to control for the military power, and maybe so we not control for the military power. We just have data for example, state capacity, but is public employees and not militaries. but we have data on militaries, so we can do that, can control that. So maybe it's a good point to control, not just for the militaries, but also for the church, I don't know. Maybe you can do a table controlling for that different kinds of elites. But one important thing here is for the state of São Paulo, of course, for example, the church elites is important for the cultural or the one. The militaries is the power is more limited in the sense that in general, it's more, in general, the coronel is not the coronel from the military, right. So it's more, it's different. But maybe it's important to control for that other elite. I will do that in a table. Yeah.
Thank you. And Esteban, last question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you're running out of time, so very rapidly. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. So I am mainly concerned about endogeneity here. So basically, if I understand your argument, you're saying that the political power of the elites is affecting education and education is affecting structural change. But I don't see any evidence here that you can say that you're identifying the exogenous effect, right? Because maybe you can think that agrarian municipalities have less education because you have less demand for education, and at the same time they have more power for the agrarian elites. So I don't know if you're able to identify that effects go in one direction, or if maybe here everything is endogenous and you're just identifying correlations. That would be my short answer.
Okay, thank you. So what you do basically is try to control to everything that we have. As I said, we don't have like a super different IV or something like that. So what you do in the first specification is control, okay, let's control for everything that we have, and let's see if the result is robust or not. Okay, so that's the result for that table here. The other solution that we have is that for some outcomes, like for example, literacy rates and the occupation data, we do a panel data set, and we track the results, the effects over the time of the 20th century in an event study analysis. So in that case, we include in our specification a municipality fixed effect and a time fixed effect. And basically all the results here is a result on the base is the first Brazilian census 1872. So I think with that results, not just the cross-section, but with the panel data, I think what we are showing here is that our results is a very, very robust result to a bunch of things. So that's the idea. But you are right that we can't basically say that we have an exogenous impact and we are capturing the causal effect of that. What you're saying here, we are doing the best that we can with the data that we can and showing that results is very robust to a bunch of things. So I think that is our explanation. The honest answer for that your question is that, okay, you are right, we don't have a exogenous variation, but I think the question is important and the data is the data that we have, so this is all you have for now.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for a fantastic presentation and for being so generous with your answers. So just to remind everyone, the next seminar in our program will be on October 15, in 2 weeks' time, when José Miguel San Juan from the Universitat de Barcelona and Martín Rodrigo from Pompeu Fabra will be presenting on la rentabilidad de la trata de esclavos cubana durante la primera mitad del siglo XIX. So yeah, we'll see you then, and thank you again very much, Pedro, for presenting your work. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the comments, suggestions, and questions. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.